The Venezuela operation, a turning point in global governance. The United States military operation in Venezuela, resulting in the capture of President Nicolas Maduro, represents a watershed moment in international relations. This action may signal the most dramatic challenge to establish global order since the Iraq invasion of 2003, potentially marking the end of meaningful constraints on American military power. Understanding the full scope of this development requires examining not only the immediate events, but their profound implications for sovereignty, international law, and the future stability of our interconnected world. The operation and its legal context. The operation involved military strikes on Venezuelan sites, with Maduro and his wife subsequently transported to New York to face drug trafficking charges. What distinguishes this action is not merely its scale, but the absence of traditional legal frameworks that have governed such interventions since World War II ended. No United Nations Security Council resolution authorized this operation. No imminent threat to American territory justified military action under self-defense principles. No multilateral coalition provided diplomatic cover for the intervention. The precedent most often cited is the 1989 Panama operation to apprehend Manuel Noriega. Yet even that controversial intervention, widely criticized at the time, rested on certain legal arguments. Noriega faced formal indictment in American courts. Panama was experiencing an internal governmental crisis, and the United States claimed invitation from competing authorities. These justifications, however tenuous, at least acknowledge that international law required some form of legal basis for military action across borders. The Venezuela operation dispenses with even this pretense. While the Attorney General described Maduro and his wife as alleged international narcotics traffickers facing charges in the Southern District of New York, criminal indictments do not authorize military invasions of sovereign nations to execute arrests. The United States maintains that it does not recognize Maduro's legitimacy following disputed elections, but political non-recognition does not constitute legal authority for armed intervention. Every principle that has constrained the use of force between nations, sovereignty, territorial integrity, non-intervention, has been set aside in favor of unilateral action based solely on American determination and necessity, constitutional and democratic governance concerns. Beyond international law, this operation raises fundamental questions about American constitutional processes. Congressional leaders, including Democratic Senator Tim Kaine, have emphasized that the Constitution requires congressional authorization for military action except in cases of imminent self-defense. The War Powers Resolution explicitly demands congressional approval for sustained military operations absent direct threats to American territory. Venezuela posed no such imminent danger. Congressional leadership received notification only after the operation had already commenced, presenting legislators with an accomplished fact rather than seeking advance authorization. This sequence establishes a troubling precedent. The executive branch can initiate military operations, then inform Congress retrospectively while American forces remain deployed and political momentum makes opposition difficult. Each time this pattern repeats without congressional pushback, it further erodes constitutional checks on executive war-making authority. President Trump stated the United States would temporarily run Venezuela until a proper transition could occur, suggesting not merely regime change, but direct American administration of a foreign nation. This goes beyond removing a problematic leader to assuming governmental functions in a sovereign country, a form of military occupation that raises additional legal and practical complications. Immediate implications for Venezuela. The situation on the ground in Venezuela remains fluid and dangerous. Venezuelan Vice President Delcy Rodriguez was reportedly sworn in, while officials demanded proof of life from Maduro and described his capture as kidnapping. The existing governmental structure, built over decades of Chavista rule, has not simply dissolved with Maduro's removal. Venezuela's military establishment has been deeply integrated into the regime's power structure, benefiting from oil revenues and control over various economic sectors. These officers face a stark choice: accept transition to an opposition government that may prosecute them for past actions, or resist American intervention to preserve their positions. The security forces include not only conventional military units, but also heavily armed paramilitary groups. the colectivos, whose ideological commitment to Chavismo may outlast Maduro's presidency. Moreover, foreign actors maintain significant presence in Venezuela. Cuban advisors have long supported the regime. Russian technicians service Venezuelan military equipment. Iranian operatives have established relationships through oil sales and other arrangements. The question of whether these foreign elements depart peacefully or support resistance efforts will significantly shape Venezuela's trajectory. The optimistic scenario envisions Venezuelan opposition figures assuming power and guiding democratic transition. However, the more probable outcome involves competing factions, armed resistance from regime loyalists, and American forces attempting to maintain order in a country that never requested their presence. This pattern, removing an authoritarian leader through military force, assuming grateful populations will embrace externally imposed governments, then confronting complex resistance, characterize the Iraq experience. The Venezuelan operation appears to be following the same troubling path. Regional repercussions across Latin America. For Latin American nations, this operation presents an impossible dilemma. Many governments oppose Maduro and desire democratic change in Venezuela, yet none advocated American military intervention. The principle of non-intervention isn't merely diplomatic rhetoric. It protects all Latin American states from potential American coercion when Washington disapproves of their policies or leadership. Brazil's position exemplifies this difficulty. Under President Lula, Brazil has criticized Maduro's authoritarianism while simultaneously opposing American interventionism. Brazilian foreign policy centers on sovereignty and non-intervention, principles forged through historical resistance to external pressure. Endorsing American action in Venezuela would abandon these foundational values. Opposing the operation risks damaging relations with Brazil's most important security partner. Brazil will likely pursue deliberate ambiguity, but such calculated silence when clear principles are violated undermines Brazilian credibility on sovereignty issues elsewhere. Colombia shares a border with Venezuela and has experienced direct consequences from Venezuelan instability, refugee flows, narcotics trafficking, and security threats. Colombian leadership wants Venezuelan stability, yet depends on American support against domestic insurgencies and criminal organizations. Faced with American intervention, Colombia must either accept the precedent that Washington can militarily intervene in neighboring countries, or oppose the operation and jeopardize crucial security assistance. Mexico confronts perhaps the starkest implications. The Trump administration has already applied substantial pressure on Mexico regarding migration and border security. If the United States invades Venezuela for insufficient cooperation on drug trafficking, Mexico could face similar threats if Washington deems Mexican efforts inadequate. This realization will almost certainly drive Mexico toward more independent foreign policy positioning and potentially closer relationships with China as a counterbalance to American pressure. Argentina's President Javier Milei has publicly praised the operation, making Argentina the most supportive Latin American government. Yet even Milei faces domestic political constraints, as Argentine collective memory of American support for military dictatorship makes any American military intervention controversial with significant portions of the population. Cuba views the Venezuela operation as validation of long-standing claims about American hostility. For decades, Cuban government has maintained that American policy threatens Cuban sovereignty and justifies Cuba's authoritarian security measures. The Venezuela intervention transforms this from defensive rhetoric into demonstrable reality, reinforcing arguments for continued militarization and centralized control as necessary defenses against external intervention. Every Latin American nation, regardless of ideological orientation, must now calculate that American military intervention remains possible if Washington determines their government problematic. This fundamentally alters regional dynamics away from partnership with the United States toward hedging strategies and balancing behaviors designed to reduce vulnerability to American power. Global strategic calculations. Nations worldwide are reassessing their security strategies based on American action in Venezuela. For American adversaries, the operation confirms that military threats must be taken with utmost seriousness and that only credible deterrent capabilities constrain American intervention. Iran's leadership has long accused the United States of seeking regime change. The Venezuela operation validates these concerns. If America invades another nation to remove its president based on criminal accusations and political opposition, Iran cannot trust that diplomatic engagement will protect Iranian sovereignty. This calculus drives Iran toward maintaining and potentially expanding deterrent capabilities, including nuclear development, as insurance against American intervention. Syria's government observed American military presence on Syrian territory for years without attempted regime change. The Venezuela operation suggests that American restraint in Syria reflected tactical assessment that Assad's removal would prove too costly, not principled opposition to regime change operations. If circumstances change, Syria must anticipate similar intervention attempts. North Korea has always maintained that only nuclear deterrence prevents American military action to eliminate the Kim regime. Venezuela's experience reinforces this calculation. Maduro possessed no nuclear deterrent and faced American military operation to remove him. Kim Jong-un will interpret this as confirmation that nuclear weapons remain essential to North Korean security. Asian nations with American security relationships face their own concerns. The Philippines, despite its defense treaty with the United States, has domestic opposition to American military presence. The Venezuela intervention will strengthen Philippine skepticism toward American bases, as these facilities could draw the Philippines into conflicts initiated by unilateral American decisions. South Korea depends on American security guarantees against North Korea. It also shares a border with an unpredictable nuclear-armed neighbor. If the United States would pursue regime change in North Korea through military force, a scenario that now appears more plausible, South Korea would bear catastrophic costs. The Venezuela operation demonstrates that America makes such decisions without necessarily full consultation with allies who face the consequences. Japan's constitutional commitment to defensive operations only creates additional complications. If American decisions about military intervention force Japan into conflicts that violate constitutional principles, it would create severe domestic political crisis while damaging the alliance that forms the cornerstone of Japanese security policy. The European dilemma. European nations face their own crisis of principle versus alliance. The European Union constructed its identity around commitment to international law, sovereignty, multilateral decision-making, and rules-based order. The Venezuela operation violates all these principles explicitly. Supporting American action undermines everything the EU claims to represent. Opposing the operation damages transatlantic relations that provide the foundation for European security against potential Russian aggression. France may publicly criticize American action, consistent with its tradition of independent foreign policy. Germany will likely remain officially silent while privately expressing concerns to American counterparts. The United Kingdom, as America's closest ally, may support the operation or at least decline to criticize it. This division within Europe further weakens European capacity for unified foreign policy and damages European credibility when invoking international law in other contexts. European Commission Vice President Kaja Kallas reiterated that Maduro lacks legitimacy while calling for respect of international law principles, attempting to thread an impossible needle by acknowledging American political concerns while maintaining commitment to legal frameworks. This careful balancing act satisfies no one and highlights European inability to influence American decision-making when Washington determines intervention necessary. Russia and China's strategic opportunity. For Russia and China, American intervention in Venezuela provides an invaluable gift. Russian diplomatic messaging has claimed for years that American commitment to rules-based order is fundamentally hypocritical, that Washington invokes international law against others while ignoring legal constraints on its own behavior. The Venezuela operation proves this argument decisively. Russia can now point to Venezuela when defending interventions in Ukraine, Syria, or anywhere else Russian forces operate. The argument becomes straightforward. America intervenes unilaterally when claiming security interests or opposition to authoritarian regimes. Russia does the same thing. If American intervention in Venezuela is legitimate, so is Russian intervention elsewhere. This equivalence argument, previously somewhat strained, now rests on concrete precedent of American unilateral military action without legal authorization. China makes parallel arguments regarding Taiwan, the South China Sea, and any territorial disputes. If the United States can intervene militarily when claiming vital interests without international authorization, China can invoke identical logic when asserting its core interests. American credibility in advocating for rules-based international order collapses when America demonstrates it does not follow the rules it expects others to observe. This collapse of credibility matters profoundly because international law functions only when states believe powerful nations will genuinely constrain themselves. When powerful states ignore rules whenever convenient, weaker states conclude that law is merely rhetorical cover for power politics, and that real international relations operate purely on power calculations. This drives every nation toward power accumulation, arms races, alliance building, and regional conflicts, precisely the dynamics that rules-based order was designed to prevent. International law and erosion of constraints. The legal framework governing state relations rests on the principle that states are sovereign equals under law, protected from external interference except in narrow circumstances. The United Nations Charter explicitly prohibits the use of force against territorial integrity or political independence of states, with exceptions only for self-defense and Security Council-authorized humanitarian intervention. American action in Venezuela fits none of these narrow exceptions. Venezuela did not attack the United States. No self-defense claim exists. The United Nations did not authorize intervention. The United States simply decided unilaterally to remove Venezuela's government through military force and capture its head of state, a textbook violation of international law and charter principles. If this becomes accepted precedent, international law becomes effectively meaningless. The most powerful state can simply ignore legal constraints when convenient, invoking domestic law or political justifications to override international obligations. This is precisely what occurred with Iraq in 2003. The United States invaded without UN authorization, claiming self-defense against potential future threats and humanitarian intervention to remove an authoritarian regime. International legal scholars condemned the invasion as illegal, but could not prevent it. The Venezuela operation reinforces this precedent and makes explicit that American conception of international order is power-based rather than rules-based. America creates and enforces rules for others, but exempts itself when rules would constrain American action. This framework is inherently unsustainable because it destroys the legitimacy that makes international law effective. If rules apply only to weak states but not powerful ones, then rules aren't law. They're simply expressions of power relationships, and weaker states have no reason to comply except through coercion. The return to great power competition. We are witnessing a fundamental transformation from rules-based international order toward 19th century great power competition, where might makes right, and only balance of power prevents conflict. This shift is profoundly dangerous because balance of power systems are inherently unstable. Shifts in relative power create temptations to use force while opportunity exists. Alliances shift based on power calculations rather than shared values. Arms races accelerate as states pursue capabilities to deter potential adversaries. Security dilemmas emerge as defensive preparations by one state appear threatening to others, provoking countermeasures that reduce everyone's security. This is precisely how World War I began. Shifting power balances, security dilemmas, alliance systems that transformed local conflicts into general war, and absence of effective international constraints on military action. The Venezuela operation, if it becomes accepted precedent, accelerates our return to this dangerous pattern by demonstrating that the most powerful country does not accept meaningful legal constraints on its military actions when it determines force is necessary. Every American adversary now recalculates deterrence requirements based on demonstration that American military threats are credible and that diplomatic engagement does not reliably protect sovereignty. This drives nuclear proliferation, military buildups, and aggressive efforts to secure deterrent capabilities before becoming targets of American intervention. American allies similarly recalculate their positions. If the United States operates without legal constraints or meaningful consultation with partners who bear consequences of American actions, these allies must develop independent capabilities and policy options. This weakens alliance structures that have underpinned American global influence and creates opportunities for competitors to expand their influence by offering alternatives to American partnerships. Long-term trajectories and systemic instability. The immediate question of what happens in Venezuela whether transition to democracy succeeds or the country descends into prolonged conflict, will significantly impact regional stability. However, the broader implications for international order extend far beyond Venezuela's borders. We are entering a period where international relations operate increasingly on pure power calculations rather than legal frameworks. This environment rewards military strength, punishes weakness, and creates incentives for every state to maximize its power and minimize vulnerabilities. Regional conflicts will likely increase as states test the new boundaries of acceptable behavior. Arms races will accelerate as nations pursue deterrent capabilities. Alliance structures will become more fluid as states hedge against uncertainty about great power intentions and reliability. This trajectory is not inevitable, but becomes increasingly probable as precedents accumulate demonstrating that international law does not effectively constrain powerful states. Each violation that goes unchallenged by effective international response reinforces the lesson that power matters more than law. Each time international institutions prove unable to prevent or meaningfully respond to violations, faith in those institutions diminishes further. The alternative would require recommitment by major powers, particularly the United States, to operating within international legal frameworks and accepting meaningful constraints on unilateral action. It would require rebuilding multilateral institutions and decision-making processes that give all nations, not just the most powerful, genuine voice in collective security decisions. It would require recognizing that short-term advantages gained through unilateral force often create long-term costs through erosion of the cooperative frameworks that serve everyone's interests. Whether the current trajectory toward great power competition and conflict can be reversed, or whether we are witnessing the fundamental breakdown of the post-World War II order, remains to be determined. What is clear is that the Venezuela operation represents a critical inflection point, a moment when the constraints that have limited the use of force between nations were openly set aside in favor of unilateral power projection. How the international community responds to this moment will shape the nature of global order for decades to come. The coming weeks and months will reveal whether this operation was an aberration or the beginning of a new era in international relations. The precedent has been set. The question now is whether it will be challenged, contained, or accepted as a new normal in how nations interact. The answer will determine not only Venezuela's future, but the future of international law, sovereignty, and the possibility of a world governed by rules rather than purely by power.